One thing you might see when I post the stat sheets from days gone by is you might have two teams running two different engines, but the thing is, they might be the same engine, just badged differently. If that sounds confusing, I do apologise, I haven't slept. One method of doing this is how Williams and Benetton ran rebadged Renault engines in the late 90s, after Renault withdrew at the end of 1997. And that actually got me thinking, why didn't Williams and Benetton try and source engines from a company that could make something newer and better? I guess Williams was getting BMW for 2000, but running 1997 engines rebadged Mechachrome and Supertech for 2 years wasn't exactly productive. Now that's something else within the something else, because Mechachrome is a technical partner of Renault, and Mechachrome has been doing engines for Renault since the 70s, but yeah. And the reason Renault withdrew in the first place is because the company had recently been privatised, and they didn't think the shareholders would want their money being spent on some F1 engine folly. In 1999, the blueprints were handed over to Supertech, which was owned by Flavio Briatore. That's one way of doing things. The other way is the way of Ford and Cosworth. Even though Ford owned Cosworth by the time of the 90s, everything to do with their engines during this period was badged as a Ford, even though the engine was a Ford Cosworth engine. It was Benetton Ford, Simtech Ford, Minardi Ford, Forti Ford, and so on. But engines supplied to works teams were badged as the Ford Z-Tech, while customer engines, the lumps of iron that power the likes of Lola, Forti, Tyrrell, Simtech and similar, were badged as Cosworth EEDs. Probably because of the sheer gulf in power between them, because the engine that Tyrrell and Lola had in 1997 had less power than the engine that Schumacher had in 1994, although it was 500cc smaller. Same company, different badges. But despite this, on the Constructors' Championship tables, they're all listed as Fords, and not Ford Cosworths. It's all many confuse. But there is another brand that operated similar to how Renault did in the 1990s, and that company is Mugen. And you can't talk about Mugen without first mentioning Honda, and Honda's history in Formula 1 is a pretty decent one. The Japanese car company first entered Formula 1 back in the 1960s, designing and building the car in Japan for 1964, and then opened a base in Amsterdam to cover their operation in 65 and 66, before moving to Slough in 1967, and then left in 1968. The 1965 Mexican Grand Prix being one of the few times a car built outside of Britain, Italy or France has won a World Championship event, but Honda was gone at the end of the 1968 season, owing in part to the death of Joe Schlesser at Rouen when his magnesium panelled car crashed and caught fire, and Honda also wanted to focus on the American market. Honda came back in 1983, designing a turbo engine that debuted with the Spirit team at that year's Race of Champions at Brands Hatch, the last ever non-championship round in Formula 1 history. Despite Murray Walker bigging up the engine, saying that it had done thousands of problem-free testing miles, the car died after just 5 laps because the car had a fuel delivery issue or something along those lines. Later in the 1983 season, Honda switched to supplying Williams as they got rid of their naturally aspirated Cosworth DFVs, which seems odd in today's Formula 1. We've seen Alpine announce recently they'll be getting Mercedes power for 2026, but swapping supplier in the middle of a season isn't something that would happen today. It took until the 1984 Dallas Grand Prix for Honda to get a win on the board. By the end of 1985, it was quite clear that they could run with BMW, Renault and Ferrari. Honda spent big money on their engine program. Nigel Mansell, who used Honda engines at Williams, said that Honda could be building as many as 6 different specifications of engine per season to try and outdevelop the rest, and make sure they had the best engine at all times, while other manufacturers simply took what they had and improved it little by little. As a result, Honda went on to take 6 titles in a row as a constructor or engine supplier between 1986 and 1991, and 5 drivers' titles. A run that was matched by Ferrari between 1999 and 2004, and only bettered by Mercedes winning their 8 in a row. Between 1986 and 1991, having a Honda engine should have been a cheat code. Except, no, because Honda didn't always give everybody the same engine if they were supplying multiple teams. In 1987, Williams got the latest and greatest RA167E because they had first dibs through an existing contract, while Lotus had to have the 166E that had a lower fuel limit and a bigger restriction on the turbocharger. However, in 1988, Lotus and McLaren had the same engine, but only one team was winning races that year. Alright, 2, but the second one wasn't a Lotus, put it that way. In 1991, McLaren got a brand new V12 from Honda, while Tyrrell had to make do with a 1990 spec V10 that McLaren had used in 1990. And while McLaren enjoyed full support from Honda, Tyrrell had to make do with support from somebody else. Mugen. And this leads us nicely into things. M-Tech Company Limited, or just simply Mugen, which means unlimited, is a company that was founded in 1973 by Hirotoshi Honda, the son of Soichiro Honda. And that's where any coincidences lie, because Mugen is not Honda. It's a separate tuning company, with Mugen selling upgrade kits and other stuff like that for Honda cars. Mugen is not owned by Honda and has never, at any point, been owned by Honda. Hirotoshi Honda has also never worked for Honda, despite being a major shareholder. The company initially focused on making racing engines for sale and also aftermarket parts for Honda's cars. Hirotoshi had been building his own cars in a workshop since 1965, and his business partner, Masao Kimura, had over 50 wins in Honda sports cars and single-seaters. In the 1980s, Formula 3000, which is now Formula 2, arrived in Japan, and Mugen teamed up with Honda to build the engines for the Japanese series. In 1987, 14 teams in Japanese Formula 3000 had Mugen engines. The following year, 4 of the top 5 in Japanese Formula 3000 had Mugen engines. In 1989, they'd come over to Europe, and Jean Alesi, driving for Eddie Jordan's team, won the championship with a Mugen engine. In 1990, Mugen was taking over European Formula 3 series, and the British Championship was won by Mika Hakkinen and then Rubens Barrichello the following year with a Mugen-powered car. The same year Barrichello won British Formula 3, Mugen was also working with Tyrrell, prepping their Honda engines that were 1990 spec V10s, which we've already covered, while Honda was all hands on deck with Senna over at McLaren. Tyrrell had the older engine, and Mugen was simply looking after it for them. Tyrrell managed to push through the season with their 020 chassis and 12-month-old engine, managing to score double points at Phoenix as they had Pirelli tyres that just seemed to love that track for some reason, and Stefano Modena got a podium in Canada, with a further 6th place at Japan. The newer V12 in the McLaren won the championship. For 1992 though, Mugen had switched to Footwork. It was a team-up of the Japanese over there, because Mugen is a Japanese company, and Footwork is also a Japanese company, well, was a Japanese company, with Japanese driver Aguri Suzuki driving one of the cars, alongside Michele Alboreto. The engine, the same one Senna had won the 1990 title with, was still in service, and in the Footwork car, it seemed to last a little better than it did in the Tyrrell. For Footwork, it was a needed boost as well, because during the course of 1991, the team had used Ford and Porsche engines and not scored a single point, not qualifying 20 times split between the two cars. Out of the remaining 12 occasions, the cars made the finish line just 4 times. But 1992 was an instant improvement for the FA13. Both cars finished at South Africa, although Suzuki didn't qualify for Mexico. Alboreto then found some form, finishing 6th, 5th, 5th, and then a string of 7ths with a 9th in Germany and 15th in Japan. But going into the next season, Derek Warwick replaced Alboreto and they finished with 4 points versus the 1992 tally of 8. But the best result of the season was a 4th place. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, as Martin Brundle would say. But at the end of 1992, Honda had left Formula 1 completely, so this just left Mugen, who were running Honda-derived engines. So basically the whole arrangement was kind of like how Toyota is working with Haas today, even though they're not Toyota engines, they're Ferrari engines, but Toyota is still having some input but not putting in a lot of money, if you follow me. At the end of 1993, Footwork switched to Ford, with Mugen now taking their 4-year-old Honda engine to Lotus. The engine by this point was now called the MF351HC, an upgrade over the MF351HB that had been used in 1993 and the MF351H in 1992, which was essentially a rebadged 89-1990 Honda. The engine was chucking out 725 horsepower in 1994, which was way down on the Renault offering, but had shown in the past that it was able to score points. The problem with 1994 was Lotus was in the mud and sinking fast, and the final car they built, the 109, was incredibly late. In addition, you had the frankly, scary crash suffered by Pedro Lamy while testing at Silverstone that didn't help matters. Lotus and Mugen did not score a single point through the course of 1994, which is the only time in Mugen and Lotus's history that this ever happened. For 1995, Mugen would be switching supply again, this time to Ligier, although it shouldn't have been Ligier. By this point, Ligier was in the hands of Mr. Briatore, and Flavio had convinced Mugen to supply his newly acquired team instead of Minardi, whom Mugen had already got a contract with. Mugen said they couldn't do this because of the contract, but Flavio had supposedly offered to pay any damages incurred so he could get a hold of these engines. And this annoyed Giancarlo Minardi immensely, because not only was Minardi losing a half-decent and increasingly dependable engine, Flavio allegedly never paid Giancarlo his damages. It was all supposedly settled for around $1 million. For 1995, Mugen and Honda had to develop a new engine. The engines had now been shrunk by 500cc to 3 litres to conform to the rule changes brought in following the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix. The MF301H was used by Ligier exclusively, and the car was moderately successful considering it was, well, basically a Benetton clone. The drivers in Olivier Panis, Aguri Suzuki and Martin Brundle were able to consistently fight for points, and in an era where only the top 6 scored and reliability was a thing, they did alright. If we were using the modern system, Ligier would have scored at pretty much every single race the cars finished, with Panis and Brundle both finishing on the podium at some point during the season. And if Brundle had run the whole season, then maybe the points tally would have been even greater. But what was good about the engine reset is that Mugen could get on a better playing field, as the engine that they had created with Honda put out 675 horsepower. Down on 1994's power output, but you have to factor in the rule change. The Renault in the Williams and Benetton ran between 675 and 700, depending on how hot they were running it. Also at this time, it's hard to find out how much input Honda was giving Mugen to help them out, or what they might have been supplying in terms of parts. But from what I can gather through going through old Autosport forum posts and archived posts from about 25 years ago, which sounds mental that I'm digging through stuff from 25 years ago on the internet, is that Mugen was essentially acting as Honda without the Honda. Honda's own website says that they were working in a low-key capacity with Mugen. So really, Honda was building the engines and Mugen does all the development work, so Honda doesn't have to. It saves Honda a bit of money, I guess. But in 1996, Mugen finally hit the big time. I remember Ben Edwards on the 1996 season review VHS tape calling the Mugens formidable, and they were getting even more powerful, to the point where they were nudging 700 horsepower. To be honest, I can recall most of that script verbatim, seeing as I watched it so much as a kid. But one thing that will always stand out about 1996 is that one of the smaller teams won a race that year, when Olivier Panis won the Monaco Grand Prix. Not only was it a big deal that a smaller team won, but it was also Monaco, and a French driver in a French car, sponsored by French companies and running in French blue, had just won at Monaco, even though Monaco and France are separate. At the same time, it was a big lift for the team, because only a couple of months earlier Pedro Diniz in the second car was plastered all over the back pages of the papers for all the wrong reasons. At Argentina, a fuel valve had got stuck open, so he was pissing fuel everywhere. The fuel got ignited on the hot exhaust and the car went up in a rather spectacular fireball, leading the British media to run the headline, "Dinner's in the oven." Dinner's, it's a clever pun. Not often that the Sun should get some credit, but they actually printed something that wasn't BS for once. And now to see what Becky, aged 21 from Colchester, thinks about that on page 3. And if you live in the UK and you don't know what page 3 is, ask your dad. In 1997, Ligier was now Prost, and Mugen kept up engine supply simply because Prost's planned switch to Peugeot engines couldn't happen until the Mugen contract had run out. And come to think of it, maybe Prost should have stuck with Mugen, because now the engine was putting out over 700 horsepower and Panis was putting in some mega results in the early part of the season. 5th in Austria, 3rd in Brazil, 4th at a soaked Monaco, but then his season came to a premature end. Well, not completely, but effectively, at Canada. Panis and Prost could have done much better that year, but at the end of the year, Prost was now able to get Peugeot engines to make his all-French team, while Mugen went the other way to join Jordan, who had just signed 1996 champion Damon Hill. Other engine manufacturers, most notably Mercedes and Ferrari, had managed to outdevelop Mugen and the others at this point. It was clear from the outset who the championship contenders were, and Mugen had fallen behind slightly. On top of this, the Jordan 198 was struggling as the team tried to get around the new narrow track rules and the grooved tyres, and patience was wearing thin all round. Mugen blamed the car, Jordan blamed the engine, and Benson and Hedges were wanting answers from both because they were thinking, come on lads, we have Damon effing Hill in the car and you're giving him that bucket of bolts. Sort it out. So Jordan and Mugen sorted it out, and they won the 1998 Belgian Grand Prix. Even better still, it was a 1-2, And you can complain about Damon's radio message to the pit wall all you want, but Eddie did what Eddie had to do. It was just business. And between Silverstone and the end of the season, Jordan managed to score points at every single race except for the Nürburgring. So the form continued into 1999. Frentzen swapped with Ralph, and he and Damon should have been a good pairing that should have done even better than 1998, but it wasn't to be. Damon was reaching the end of his career and didn't get along with the groove tyres, as well as feeling like he should probably walk away from the sport. Frentzen, meanwhile, managed to bag 2 race wins and was a dark horse for the title at one point, with a win at the Nürburgring being taken away from him thanks to a legal form of launch control burning out his electrics. At the end of the 1999 season, Honda came back and supplied engines to Jordan at the same time as BAR, before dumping Jordan altogether after the 2002 season because BAR had the exclusive supply, despite Jordan beating BAR in both 2001 and 2002. A decision that probably accelerated the Jordan downfall, but I've covered all that already. Between 1992 and 2000, Mugen engines participated in 147 races and won 4, which doesn't seem like a lot, but remember this was an era where Renault was supreme before the reins were handed over to Mercedes and Ferrari. To have 4 wins when Williams, Benetton, McLaren and Ferrari were the top teams is an incredible statistic, and a total of 172 points was scored, which again doesn't seem like a lot, but this was over 16 or 17 races a season at an era where only the top 6 got points. By the tail end of the 90s, Mugen had established itself as best of the rest, with the cars it powered able to cause a couple of upsets and take some big points. But what's even cooler is that Mugen has more wins in Formula 1 than Toyota. Yes, Mugen had a technical partnership with Honda, but they weren't the same company. But the company was working with the brains rather than the checkbook, and managed to pull off results that Toyota, with its resources, simply were not able to do. And while we like to think of those plucky smaller teams that won with budgets that got absolutely dwarfed by the big boys, when Mugen won with Ligier and Jordan, it was team and engine company with smaller budgets that managed to beat the big boys. And that's something that's kind of lost from Formula 1. When Honda rejoined with full factory support, there just wasn't going to be enough room for both. Honda was in and they didn't need Mugen anymore, they were going to do it by themselves. Between their return in 2000 and when they left in 2008, they scored just 1 win. 1 versus Mugen's 4. It probably made some sense to keep Mugen around, but it's Honda's decision, and well, it's just business, isn't it? So then, a look at the Mugen-Honda engines in Formula 1. Honda without the Honda. If this has made things a bit clearer on a period of Formula 1 history you might have been confused about, then do like the video so I know I did a good job. And for more stuff like this from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help keep things running around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So we've had Honda without the Honda, and now Patreon without the Patreon. But anyway, until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.